we've had a look at we had a little look at some of your blog posts and stuff. So we were thinking maybe we could just chat about some of that.
Sure.
And I know in the message you sent me, you were talking about like psychoanalytic takes on sex, intimacy, and tenderness, and using that in dating and stuff. So I thought that was quite interesting. I mean, obviously you wanted to talk about that, so I thought maybe we could start there, I guess.
Sure. I guess that's partly my own curiosity about your project, because I think if you frame the ban sex now slogan, it's one that asks lots of questions, but the first thing that comes to mind for me is that I love what Foucault has to talk about in his history of sexuality. He has this whole thing of part of the problem maybe is that sex as an act is subordinated to sexuality. And he has this whole thing, his whole take being sexuality is great, we should explore it and do what we want with it, but sex is kind of the worst thing we can hook sexuality up to. It only ever like limits the potential of what that can be, or it's hooking it up to power in a way that the history of sexuality often calls into question. But I wonder, I guess that's something that I think about, I guess, as a philosophy nerd and also just in life. But I guess that's probably me asking you a question of where you position yourselves in the brilliance of your brash slogan.
Yeah, I guess we're kind of against everything in a way. And I think that it was meant to be a provocative statement to kind of think about sex differently, or I think, as you said, to think about sex or sexuality outside of the act, or like what the act means. Yeah, it's supposed to be very open, so we try not to kind of over explain it, but we obviously have had a lot of conversations about it, and we want to like have more conversations about it with other people, including yourself. So but definitely we sort of thought a bit about like Foucault and psychoanalysis, and even like, you know, Houellebecq and his kind of meteoric rise to popularity on the internet, and how what he has to say about sex, how it converges with incel discourse, and just this like very uncomfortable, there's something about sex which we just can't talk about because it is very hidden, while at the same time we're just bombarded with images of sex, and like we supposed to want it, and we have to want it, and to not want it or to not achieve it in a specific way is seen as some kind of failure. These kind of things, like I don't know, I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I had a lot of conversations with people about like what sex positivity means now, and like how it kind of doesn't necessarily mean what it used to mean, and it's kind of almost like you have to want like specific types of sex, or actually want sex all the time, which is not actually how a lot of people feel about it, I found. And I think that was interesting. And also just the fact that like, yeah, we're bombarded with images of sex all the time, but put ban sex now on a t-shirt and everyone's like, whoa.
Yeah.
So I guess I mean, it was a provocation, I guess. And like, I think sex is something that's worth thinking about. It like, it is an important thing, and there is something going on there that's like interesting and like important.
Yeah, I guess it's something that I think that you've written about before, kind of in line with I guess it would be like Deleuze and Guattari, like just the libido as like this life force that's very fluid and can attach itself to anything, and yet is very constrained in I guess like a heteronormative, like heteropatriarchal, whatever you want to call it. You know, we are conditioned to think about sex in a specific way from a very young age, and there is something sort of also like fascistic about this idea of sex, and also I guess that is what sort of produces inceldom or incel culture, is this like Darwinistic idea of like a sexual marketplace, and you know, just sort of competition and possessiveness and all these. I mean, I'm speaking very vaguely here, but just to try and like get something out there. Yeah, I don't want to speak too much.
Yeah, I agree with you both. I think it's really interesting, and I think there's that sense that sex is, and kind of bodies. I guess I kind of can't separate sex positivity from kind of body positivity, where no one wants to trash being positive about yourself and the ways that you feel and relate to people, but then it's like we have crossed a line where it's not just that that positivity isn't forced. Sex and the body are insisted upon, to a point, where it is sort of fascistic. It's sort of there's a power play there where you're meant to be empowered by your own giving yourself over to your libido in some sense, but on whose terms? And it's probably not our own most of the time, given how those things are, insisted upon, but within a very limited framework, or against a very kind of limited set of images or examples, maybe. I guess I always find this interesting where, especially now in conversations where there's this a kind of new, what's the word? I was going to say resistance, I guess, like a negative attitudes towards porn, which I guess that's been kind of a historical thing, and then it's waned, and then maybe we're going back there. But I feel like it is just that realization, right, that there's more than what we're sort of told to expect, and there's probably a lot more fun to be had in, wholly shattering that very limited heteronormative framework, or even the sort of fascistic thing. I feel like it's always, if you want to talk to someone about your sexual desires, it's, well, what's your fetish then? It's like, well, what if you don't have a fetish? What if you just what if you just want to have a good time? And I don't know, it's that strange. I think I couldn't really put it better than how you put it, Alex. I think there's something so sort of hidden that is seductive and interesting, but it's almost like by shining the brightest torch on that, we kind of blow out all the interesting bits. So just ban it and let's have a do-over.
Well, we were thinking about this also because there was a bit in one of your blog posts where you're talking about like living a non-fascist life. I think me and Alex are talking about, is it possible to have like non-fascist sex?
That's what I like about Foucault's point on it. What does he say in this? It's a really nice line, and I wanted to pull it out because I thought this would come up. And this is a quote from Foucault. So we must not refer a history of sexuality to the agency of sex, but rather show how sex is historically subordinate to sexuality. We must not place sex on the side of reality, and sexuality of that of confused ideas and illusions. Sexuality is a very real historical formation. It is what gave rise to the notion of sex as a speculative element necessary to its operation. And this is the key bit, I guess, where he says, we must not think that by saying yes to sex, one says no to power. On the contrary, one tracks along the course laid out by the general deployment of sexuality. It's the agency of sex that we must break away from if we aim, through a tactical reversal of the various mechanisms of sexuality, counter the grips of power with the claims of bodies, pleasures, and knowledges in their multiplicity and their possibility of resistance. The rallying point for the counterattack against the deployment of sexuality ought not to be sex, but bodies and pleasures. Which I guess is quite dense, especially to read it out rather than to read it down. But read it out rather than... Anyway. But I think that's kind of the point. And I think that's where, if Deleuze and Guattari's sense of a non-fascist life comes in. I mean, I guess that is also Foucault's phrase, right? That's how he describes Anti-Oedipus, as a guide to a non-fascist life. I think that's probably why they are talking about, in Capitalism and Schizophrenia, that tension, that maybe you could say, if the deployment of sexuality ought not to be sex but bodies and pleasures, well, what's sex in that regard? Is this kind of... Is sex in terms of like a sexual economy? I guess like you were saying, like sex as a kind of... something that's a kind of a power play in maybe a non-sexy way, a kind of economic, I don't know, there's that kind of notion of exchange, that kind of heteronormative notion of exchange that's not about bodies. I guess that's kind of the thing that comes for the fantasy that sex is, right? That it's this kind of, it's an ideal and an idea. It's something that maybe we have more often in our mind than in our bodies. Despite the fact, that the body's kind of insisted upon, or it's a certain kind of body that we're sort of said is deserving or warrants or capable of having pleasure. As soon as we sort of, if we carve out describe the bounds of how we actually understand sex, bodies and pleasures far exceed those bounds, and sex becomes quite a sort of unfit it's almost unfit for purpose, really. And it's interesting to think what to do about that. It's kind of my one frustration with Deleuze and Guattari in a lot of ways, is that it's so there in a lot of their texts, and they rely on a lot of people like D.H. Lawrence, who I kind of have a bit of a thing for, but discuss sex in such unsexy terms. And maybe that's a good thing, or I don't know, maybe that's probably, I'm questioning my own sense of what's sexy now, but I don't know. It's philosophical language doesn't get me going. That's it, at least not in that way. But I think it's how to talk about that. It does require a kind of whole sort of tearing up of language, of, I guess, not just theoretical language, maybe on the one hand, or maybe that's what does it. Theoretical language, talking about sex psychoanalytically or philosophically or whatever, is wholly unsexy. And maybe that's an interesting point to make, really. that even how we talk about sex sexily is such a limited sort of lexicon that we've got to work with. Like, I think what does it? Someone said, I think it's one of the defenses that was made of D.H. Lawrence, when he sort of keeps using the word fuck in a lot of his writing, and it's like for his obscenity trials, and a lot of the initial things are like, well, it's kind of perfect that you have a word like fuck to describe sex, because it is a punch through language. That's kind of the why he as a writer wanting to talk about pleasures and bodies has to use it. It is a kind of, to a sort of moral disposition, it's a gutter punch. In a way, maybe that more so than sort of the image of sex is, or I don't know, that language actually does more to shake that social understanding free of itself than maybe just like porn and dating apps and Love Island is really capable of doing, despite its sort of insistence. And I guess, the point, it being its insistence to the contrary, doesn't make us feel good, doesn't really talk, it doesn't really engage with bodies or pleasures, only sex. And that's probably the problem.
I think that, one of our big questions is what is sex? How do people define sex? I don't know if you have any kind of, it's a hard question.
Gosh, yeah. I think maybe that's what I like about a lot of, because I think I read a lot about sex in a way that, I guess, in literature, I really love a lot of modernist stuff that really tries to, because I guess it's also, and in a sort of sort of masochistic way, that it's like you have those bad sex awards and things because sex is often written about so terribly. I always think I find it interesting how different writers do engage with whatever sex is, but maybe it just makes, I'm just going to reveal myself as a bit of a romantic or something, but there's something it is that sort of mystical poetic thing that is that punching through of language that makes it interesting, I guess, as a topic for literature, but also for philosophy, that it's that maybe that thing that escapes language. I mean, I kind of what's sexuality in relationship to sex? What is it to be sexualized? What is it to, I kind of don't really know how to separate that kind of suffix from, is sexuality are we talking about a practice, about an ethics, about a set of social relations? Where sex fits into that, it kind of fits into all of them. But I guess that's not really a definition at all. I guess that's probably why it's hard to define. It is this kind of amorphous thing that is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. That's more than just an act. Because it's about bodies and pleasures. And what's more seemingly ineffable and hard to communicate about the human condition than our experiences of our bodies and the pleasures. Sex is sort of a trace of that, maybe a sort of shadow of something a bit bigger. And I'm not sure I can articulate what either of those things is, but maybe that's the interest. Sex is weird. Maybe that's my definition.
Yeah, I definitely think that this idea of bodies and pleasures is sufficiently broad and abstract to sort of be a good starting point. I mean, they're also, I guess, hard to define. I think that we can't get away from the body ultimately, like, even with like digital sex and like this sort of sex that doesn't involve physical contact. It sort of still begins and ends in the body and the bodily response, and people just using technology for this purpose. Another thing that really resonated was this idea of sex as something that escapes language, is beyond kind of representation almost, because it is represented very in like 4K HD, I was actually thinking today about how a lot of like past sexual experiences that I've had with partners and so on, reality begins to mirror like these kind of like, images that unsettled me a bit, because it made me sort of realize how much we like understand ourselves and other people, as objects, like through these kind of images. So yeah, when everything's visible, it's no longer like something that's erotic or sacred, or, when it becomes this rehearsed thing, it loses that, even the desirability eventually, when it's just this kind of parody, it just begins to lose its like sheen or something. I don't know.
Well, it's pure performance, I suppose, right? And I guess that's especially true when we're talking about porn. But yeah, I think that is kind of true. That's something that I have often found difficult no, difficult's the wrong word, but definitely complex in, sort of personal sexual relationships, where it makes me think of like Judith Butler talks about like her sort of gender performativity, and I guess she's consciously separating sex from gender, but performance for her is just the stylized repetition of actions. It's unstable, but it's just sort of habit forming, and I feel like that's I'm not really anti-porn, but I'm kind of anti the performativity that it kind of gives rise to, for sure. That fantasy, where fantasy isn't even play, it reduces fantasy down to a stylized repetition, which seems like, as a kind of description, feels kind of apt for sex in general, or just kind of reducing it to like a sort of masturbatory repetition that's kind of quite hollow. There's no tenderness there, and I guess that's the thing that I sort of find really interesting, is that in thinking about sex, sort of in our contemporary landscape, is that that desire for tenderness, which doesn't have to be sort of romantic softness, but something that certainly goes beyond stylized depictions of sex, the kind of repetitious depictions. All of it just feels sort of really quite, for something that feels completely subsumed in fantasy. It's imaginatively speaking really poor, if that makes sense, which seems like such a contradiction.
Yeah.
I guess a lot of it comes out of these big American production house like companies, and so it's like kind of standardized production, I guess. And a lot of it can be I guess it's something that people have commented on, how sort of ridiculous the scripting is, and the removal of any sort of emotion from that, or obviously it doesn't have to be a violent act. I mean, for some people it is, but it is quite kind of cringe, I guess.
I asked Alex the other day if he thought sex was cringe.
Can be.
I was actually just about to ask that. It's really funny that you said that. What do you think? Do you think sex is cringe?
Yeah. I was a bit more enthusiastic than I intended to be. But I guess because, like, I was talking to someone about this the other day. I think I'm up in Newcastle, and there was a talk here a few months ago. A writer that I really like called Cyan Guy. I think one book's called Our Aesthetic Categories, and she sort of talks about cute as like a new kind of increasingly ubiquitous word that actually maybe we're using in a way that refers to a new kind of aesthetic experience. And I think someone here was talking about cringe in the same sort of way. It's an affect that maybe is describing something quite new, quite postmodern. I don't know how to define cringe, but I feel like it's kind of felt. It's a bodily response that certainly feels like I'd certainly cringe when watching a lot of porn, but then there's someone else I remember, I think that's also part of the definition of porn though too, and I can't remember who said this, but it's sort of the necessary cleft that you get between, say, like Hollywood romance and a pornographic film. In Hollywood, you'll have all the romance, all the affection, the kind of whatever sickliness and emotive, but then none of the actual sex. And then in porn, necessarily, you get all the sex, but none of the other stuff. And as if to say that keeping those two things apart is like some sort of unspoken rule that has to be maintained. It's only porn if it's... But how that fits into, I guess, other representations of sex in cinema, I find that quite interesting, though. It's not something I can say I've thought about, but it's something that I do think come back to in my own head, I guess, when I'm trying to go to bed at night or something. But it's, and I think that's it's that cleft that's cringe. I don't know what cringe is. Are we sort of something that's, if something's cringe, it feels sort of inauthentic. It's lacking something that would make us take it seriously or feel it properly as intended. There's some disconnect between intention and actualization, and that's where the cringe comes. So in that respect, sex is cringe, at least in how it's represented, right? And I guess on both sides, I think porn's really cringe, necessarily so. But so much sort of Hollywood romance can be equally as cringe for kind of the same reasons. It always has to leave something out. And really, we need both. We don't need both, but that's how we live our lives, I think. We've weirdly separated the two, and maybe we never should have done that.
Yeah, that article, Alex sent me an article once called like Beyond Based and Cringe. And like they define cringe as like overly, what's the word? Like when you're overly, like not overly honest, but like overly,
like earnest.
Yeah, earnest. Yeah, and so that's kind of like slightly the opposite of what we're defining cringe as right now, isn't it? So it's quite interesting that
Yeah, I think ContraPoints also just was defining it as like sort of lacking some kind of self-awareness. Yeah, it is hard to define. It's definitely one of the words of our age.
Cringe.
Yeah.
That actually reminds me of a Baudrillard quote. I think it's in Seduction, or maybe it was Ecstasy of Communication, but he was saying that the least seductive thing is for somebody to be like very obviously like trying to seduce you. And I mean, I don't know if he is, he is kind of a French man, but at the same time, I kind of do understand what he's saying. There's like an element of subtlety, or there's something that, we're never going to be like direct about it, and we're never going to be able to be sincere about it, because we sort of don't know necessarily what we want. And that is why I think I know what you mean about sort of being asked to like identify yourself as in a certain way, or to sort of have a fetish that is fixed and unchanging. And I guess this is like also what a lot of people feel about like straightness as well. It's like, I would never this is just something that I am essentially, and I would just never change. And it's just coming from like deep within me, and just this is something that I find slightly alienating sometimes when I talk to even sort of some friends about it. But yeah, I don't know. But sorry, you are one of these friends, right?
Yeah, I am one of these friends.
I'm sorry to
dropped in it there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Carry on. What else were you going to tell me off about?
No, that is all I had to say.
That's it.
Yeah, because in a way I feel like I can only speak personally, but I think some of the most erotic experiences don't involve sex at all, don't involve penetrative sex. And so I do find it interesting, that tension, and I think that's kind of what we're trying to get at partly with the project is that when we say something it means something else. I think it's like Zizek said about the coffee.
If you bring this logic to its extreme, you can also see how a double negation, when you don't have just, when you do not have, in this case, coffee without cream or milk, the result is not zero, but what? Another, my last example from popular culture, I think it's from early 90s. You remember the movie with Ewan McGregor before he became a Jedi, when he was still playing working class guys, Brassed Off. The hero accompanies to her home after their date a young, pretty woman who, at the entrance to her flat, tells him, "Would you like to come in for a coffee?" He answers, "There is a problem. I don't drink coffee." She retorts with a smile, "No problem. I don't have any." What I like is that, what you get through this double negation is probably the most, not vulgar, but open erotic invitation. Like, that's my point. I invite you for a coffee, then I negate coffee, and the result is not zero. The result is pure invitation.
Yeah. So the question would be...
Just an excuse to tell me I'm alienating him.
I mean, even if there's no question, I mean, I definitely relate to that. And I find that, it is what's quite alienating about the culture that we're in, or can be. I mean, no offense to you, Bella, at all, but because I guess that's it is that fixedness. I find that sense of fixedness really, or maybe it comes from for me it comes from sort of younger, sort of childhood or teenage experiences of being made to feel like you don't fit into a sort of, I guess straight is in all senses of that word, expectations, whether that's for sex or gender or whatever. I mean, what are you supposed to do with that if you don't? I mean, I was going to say if you feel indifferent about it, but I don't think it is indifference. I think that's kind of the part of the problem with sex. And it's partly like the, kind of going back to Deleuze and Guattari, they sort of have that obsession with Henry Miller, who is certainly indifferent to the world. His books are full of sex and sort of sleeping around with different women and sex workers and whatever else, but he is indifferent to the women and the men in his life and the world in general. It's a nihilism, and I don't think that's not what you find in the women writers that were kind of come up around him, where it's actually more of a not an indifference, but a kind of a real desire for a literary androgyny. A lot of them who admire D.H. Lawrence, even though he's kind of is very much a sort of masculine, quite chauvinist writer, is that despite that, he seemed for a lot of women to represent kind of a realistic psychological experience for women at that time, despite the fact that he was this male chauvinist, which kind of set his writing from the perspective of women, made it all the more intriguing that he could seemingly do both. And that being something that a lot of women writers really wanted to affirm, and I think it's interesting that it is, and I mean, I'm kind of using that with quotes, it's probably, can be quite an essentialist way of framing literary history when it comes to women writers, but there's always that sense of androgyny that comes through, I think, because as a woman, or as at least a female-bodied subject, you are placed outside of that power relation, I suppose, that certainty, a masculine certainty. And that's not to say that all certainty is masculine, but for women to find out for themselves, or even just affirm a kind of instability in terms of gender, is, I think, really interesting. And I think that's only something that maybe we're coming to now. Maybe less so in philosophy, it's kind of been there for a while, but at least in literature, where there's a kind of unstable set of sexual relations, and that's to be affirmed. I find that really interesting. What that means and how that relates to your own sort of feelings, I don't know. But I think, that sense of instability and not having a fixed sense of whatever it is that you're talking about, I mean, it's hugely important to, I think, how I think about the world, and especially sex. But it's a difficult thing to do in our present landscape, which it shouldn't be if it's set up the way that it's supposedly supposed to be set up. But yeah, there's a lot to do still.
I think that's some of the like kind of maybe problem that I have with the idea of like sex positivity now, is this idea that like everyone's experimenting and but it's like only within a certain kind of like certain boundaries, I guess, or like I don't know, like it seems that you can't really call, like sex positivity doesn't involve, like I think kind of not necessarily wanting to have sex is part of sex positivity, right? There are people that like aren't that into like I don't know, like casual sex or like we've talked about before, like fetish stuff, but like sex positivity kind of has this kind of almost pressure to like you have to be experimenting with these things like this. That's what being sex positive means. I think that's something that I've found personally. I don't know if that's just me being like maybe being a bit of a prude or something.
No, I think that's true. I actually used to weird. I don't think I don't feel like I'm really known as kind of a sex guy. I don't think it's in terms of writing or like in life, but I happen to just have like, I think, gone through life and met a lot of people that are, and I guess this is kind of context, but like sex therapists, sex workers, people that, do get into camming and things like that. I guess it's sort of just, it's kind of coming from a performance background, already sort of taboo performance and people exploring that side of things. Anyway, I actually was talking to a sex therapist about this at one point, where they were talking about how one of the things that they often deal with when talking with like whether individuals or couples is just that the only thing that needs to be said is this kind of a discussion of arousal styles, that people just don't become aroused in the same way. Sometimes it takes people a certain amount of time or a certain kind of set of circumstances or whatever. Like everybody has their, there are distinct types that they've kind of, sex therapy as a kind of industry is mapped out for how people respond and can become aroused, and it's different for everybody. And I've never had anybody, like I've never had that conversation with anybody. Like people can maybe talk sort of cavalierly about their sexual conquests and people that they've slept with, but and maybe it's too intimate. But even then, I don't know if I've been with a sexual partner and been like, what's your arousal style? Maybe that's like too clinical, but it also like feels quite tender to sort of actually figure that out with someone. And maybe people do that without using that kind of clinical language, but it is that kind of thing maybe that is sort of, it is missing from that conversation, right? Maybe in all this experimentation that's actually quite superficial. Well, it's about sex, right? It's not about bodies and pleasure. And again, I probably think, and you said this before, Alex, but I think it is true that those terms probably require a lot of, both body and pleasure require a lot of definition on their own. But I mean, the gulf at least is probably passable for our intentions. But yeah, I feel like it's that same gulf again, where it's sexual experimentation, but that's not really experimenting with your body or what you find pleasurable, because I guess that's sort of already prescribed, right? With sex and in general, we're told what we're supposed to like and find enjoyable in life in general under a capitalist system. But which it feels like a cliche to say it, really, but it's true, right? I mean, I think that's the if I'm not known as a sex guy, I'm probably known as the Mark Fisher guy. But that's the thing that I always took from Mark's work, that was questioning the role of desire under capitalism. And I think you can even break that down to, the role of desire within sex is just as sort of a interesting a battleground. That relation between sex and desire is not as blatant and as sort of predetermined maybe as we think it is. There's a lot of things to question, and there's a lot of wiggle room in there. It's kind of an awful way to phrase it, wiggle room. But there's a lot. Yeah, I guess maybe I don't know if that fits in with what you're saying, really, that maybe that's an interest, because even that, I remember you spoke to Isabel Miller, right, I think at one point. I remember having a chat with her too and asking her to try and define desire. I think that's all we talked about for like an hour. It's such a difficult. Never mind defining sex. Yeah, define desire. I mean, fucking hell. But that's what's interesting, right? They're not. None of these terms that are kind of probably I'm throwing around anyway, quite cavalierly, have that stable definition. But that's precisely why they need to be talked about.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and we are here today to help you rebrand yourself as the sex guy. I mean, you can do both. Why not both? Yeah, I remember that. I don't know if you remember the name of the piece that Mark wrote. It had this bukkake metaphor at the end. How the work, like, it's not enough for somebody to sort of suffer, but the workers have to sort of pretend to be enjoying their own subordination, but there has to be this slight element of resistance. This just stood out to me because he rarely speaks in such explicit terms about sex, I think.
I definitely remember him using that metaphor. I can't remember where he did though, but I remember because that is Mark was definitely an anti-sex guy. There's loads of his blog posts that just rail against. I kind of tried to open a bunch. They've got like the dark shimmer of sex, the obscenity of affection. What's this one? The freak of consensual sentimentality.
Sound amazing.
Yeah.
They're great, but he was really like that's kind of where I pulled that Foucault quote from, because it's one of the, I don't know, it's the sort of heresy of my own engagement with Mark's work, is that I agree with him on a lot, but I love everything that he hates. So he despises D.H. Lawrence when I quite like D.H. Lawrence a lot. Hates Bataille. I really like Bataille, but I think it's precisely because, even though I think for him it's quite stylistic a lot of the time, but those people nevertheless engage with the problems that he does, at least in my opinion. If probably gawp at that, but yeah, there's so much on the early K-punk blogs that's so vehemently anti-sex, and it comes from kind of a troubled place. He talks about sort of suffering sexual abuse and sort of wrestling with sex for kind of quite deeply traumatic reasons, but also kind of in his usual way, he can impersonalize that experience to give him a sense of distance from the problems that we sort of are facing as a society, I suppose. I think he hated just the norm of sexuality, the normified, the normied version of that is just that sex itself is something to be desired, and that at all costs too, I guess. There's like I think it's something else that's in that Foucault quote. What does he say? The Faustian pact, whose temptation has been instilled in us by the deployment of sexuality, is now as follows: to exchange life in its entirety for sex itself, for the truth and the sovereignty of sex. Sex is worth dying for. I mean, that's Foucault, what, in the 80s? History of Sexuality, Volume 1. Sounds like, sort of prefiguring the main thing beneath a lot of the incel discourse. This truth and the sovereignty of sex. That it's something, to be desired to death, or to even kill for. Which is, it's that, Foucault kind of makes it quite psychoanalytic, that, he says that's what imbues sex with the death instinct. But it's as if, kind of in a sort of morbidly fitting way, that it's taken all too literal, maybe in our current culture, that kind of idea of a sort of sex drive with a death drive. And I guess, I sort of think about the power of things like, different kinds of sci-fi that deal with that. Like David Cronenberg's body horror stuff and Crash, J.G. Ballard. But now literally you have, whatever that can say about a society that's a kind of internalized death instinct, not so much something that sex is worth dying for, but it's worth killing for, feels like sort of you can I'm kind of despairing, really, because I think you can follow the line through, you can follow that thought to where that kind of incel culture develops from, and people have been doing it for decades. But is this some sort of cash out point? It surely can't get any worse, you'd hope. But it does just seem like, as much as it's a kind of outlying ideological position, you can see how we live in a society that has produced it. It's a sort of depressing reality, really, or non-reality, surreality of that subordination to sex, or sexuality subordination to sex, that probably defines a lot of us without thinking about it. So all the better to question it. I mean, ban it even. I mean, bloody hell. I mean, I know we were sort of saying before, I guess to pull the curtain back a little bit, but I know we've been trying to organise this talk for ages. And it's kind of good, really, because it's given me so much to think about. So I've kind of not been stopped thinking about the sort of implications of all of it. And hadn't really done it that sort of consciously, I think, before you asked if you fancied a chat. And that in itself, I think, was for me even quite telling. For someone that feels like I feel like I read a lot of this stuff, but I'd never really thought about it quite like personally, or how it actually, its relevance in the here and now, until trying to think through banned sex now. It's the perfect provocation. But we live in weird times. Weird sex times.
But I mean, I think philosophy in theory is quite sexy, though, right? I don't know, but I'm kind of going off here. I actually wanted to ask you more about, because you seem to be really, engaged with D.H. Lawrence's writing, and you mentioned the way that sex is written about. I'm not so familiar with the writing itself, so would you be able to maybe sort of like go into a little bit about, what you find fascinating about that?
Yeah, sure. I guess for those that don't know, D.H. Lawrence is most famous for his book, I think it was his last book, Lady Chatterley's Lover. It's been adapted. It was adapted on the BBC fairly recently. I think that the Netflix are doing an adaptation. The best adaptation is Ken Russell's from the 70s, which is basically just soft porn, but it's quite good for that. But the thing that I think interests me about Lawrence is that it's kind of like this, for me, it's weirdly like related to, I think it's kind of part of a project my mum had a breakdown years ago, and when growing up we were just like opposites. Like I did everything in life to rebel, do everything that I knew exactly what she would have wanted me to do with my life, and I just said no to all of it and always did the exact opposite. And I think I kind of started to sort of approaching 30 and was sort of realizing that I couldn't sort of deny the influence anymore. If she'd had her way, I would have done French at school. I did German. If she'd had her way, I would have done English lit at university. I did photography, like always just to spite her. And then I started thinking about doing an English literature PhD. And I was like, fuck, she's sort of caught up with me. And I kind of have this image in my mind. We had like a really small little CD hi-fi in our room, in our living room. Really sort of ugly noughties thing that I used to go and like play Eminem singles on like Papa Roach and new metal stuff, like really quiet on a Saturday. So I'd have to get my head like really closely to where the speakers were, which was right next to her bookshelf. And I weirdly, like in the time of doing that, just memorized all the books that were on her shelf that I just thought would probably be shit because my mum liked them. But it was like D.H. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, Daphne du Maurier, the Brontes, and now as I'm older, I've kind of realised they're all my kind of favourite writers too. So maybe that's kind of demystifying that I'm not just into Lawrence for the sex, I'm into him because of my mum. Think of that what you will. But I think what I found in Lawrence was kind of like I think I remember asking my mum about it at the time, or at some point, and she was like, yeah, Lady Chatterley's Lover is like the 50 Shades of Grey of its day. And having read both, they couldn't be more different. I think what I love about Lawrence is that his language is very purple. It's quite over the top. It's all a bit frilly, but he's kind of like just a bit of a Nietzschean, and has this real desire to, like, all of his books are just about relationships between people, kind of sort of interestingly balanced. Like Lady Chatterley's lovers kind of really remembered for the things that kind of aren't put into the movies. For me anyway. So Ken Russell's the exception because there's this one scene where the plot of the novel is that Lady Chatterley, she's the woman of a manor and this kind of owns this sort of on the outskirts of a mining town, and her husband comes back from the war and he's disabled and impotent and he can't have children of his own anymore. So he says, look, as long as you don't tell anyone, go and shag about and let's have a baby. We'll just raise it as our own. And she sort of takes that permission and she meets the gardener of their sort of estate, Mellors, and has this like really sexy affair with him. And it's all very like, it is pretty sexy, but very kind of not in a... I mean, that's the benefit of the Ken Russell adaptation is it kind of reveals how weird a lot of how Lawrence's sex scenes look like if they were just porn. There's like one scene where Mellors is kind of knitting like flowers into Lady Chatterley's pubes, and it's like this really tender moment, but it looks weird on the screen. It's better when it's read. But then you have those kind of scenes that are really, really sexual, really explicit, set against like the men in the manor having conversations about the pros and cons of Bolshevism. Like the sort of class politics and the sexual politics are in their own kind of intercourse throughout the novel. It's like really quite amazing, actually. Like it's the sort of funny thing that I find quite funny about it really is that the book was banned for decades. It's kind of it was unbanned after a long obscenity trial in 1969 in the UK anyway. Then it was adapted, in the 70s by Ken Russell. But people will maybe put the sex in now. They'll show these kind of quite extravagant sex scenes, but they'll always leave out the politics. You'll get the pube scene, you won't get the Bolshevism discussion. And I find that like really telling. Because I think for Lawrence, they're kind of, there's this sense of a mechanical ravaging of nature that capitalism has, this kind of the mechanization of a proletarian body, that being as much a travesty as the kind of absence of real descriptions of sex or real passionate descriptions of sex in literature. And I guess a lot of his works just kind of, that's Lady Chatterley being the most famous, but Women in Love is wonderful, so is The Rainbow. There's lots of like travel diaries where it's kind of him going on these sort of flights. There's a book called Kangaroo, which is him travelling to Australia, well, a fictionalised version's travelling to Australia and having similar kind of excursions that are sexy and kind of quite colonial at the same time, but again, kind of always engaging the class politics, with the sexual politics. And anyway, I kind of made Lawrence make sense to myself via reading him after sort of being somewhat familiar with Deleuze and Guattari. So they rely and turn to Lawrence often for when they talk about like lines of flight that Lawrence always writes into his books. And probably like he is their central reference point for how that's actualized in literature. But then I think the interesting thing that, at least for more recently thinking about depictions of sex, depictions of sexuality more generally in literature, is that it's always kind of for D&G anyway, it's always it's men that they represent, like Henry Miller, D.H. Lawrence. It is this kind of quite binary world, an indifferent world, a flight that is kind of like the flight movie that we've had, a flight from tenderness, from the body, from pleasure. And that's under the wrong kind of rubric, maybe. You look at the different women that were writing around these different masculine modernist figures, and there's far more of this tenderness. There's a lot of sort of early lesbian narratives that are far more interesting, far more kind of engaged with this sort of body horror, I guess, of knowing, of having that self-awareness. It's kind of, the initial sort of feminist literature of being aware of how you're seen by society, how you're objectified, and the struggle of hating that, and then also the joy of using it for your own kind of sexual conquest or whatever. That's all kind of explored in loads of these novels that are then really suppressed. I'm just rambling at this point and I'm losing my thread, but that's, I guess, but Lawrence was where that started for me anyway. Lawrence was like the initial kind of sexy person that I sort of got really into sort of during lockdown, and then sort of gone outwards from there. It's like him being this sort of maybe foundational modernist, proto-modernist figure, and how he influenced not just masculine writers but women writers also in the 20th century. Really interesting to me anyway. but also because it is really sexy, or it's an exploration of sexuality that goes far beyond the sorts of narratives we take for granted nowadays. Anyway, they explore so much more than just sex. Like, so maybe sex isn't even there at all, but sexuality is explored in a way that's really liberatory, and that I think, in a lot of ways, people could probably only dream of, at least in a kind of mainstream understanding of the role of sex in the social. So I think, and maybe it's just also, it feels like a lockdown thing. And maybe that in itself is probably quite telling, but post sort of lockdown horniness, I think, is real in a lot of cities at the moment, but kind of feels like an opportunity for a do-over, if that makes sense. Maybe, COVID, well, there was like a ban sex now, they did ban sex in COVID, and then maybe for some people that be like stuck to that, maybe that's I have this conversation with my friends a lot, where it does feel like there was that kind of some sort of sex ban, and actually coming out of that, they've started to think about sex post-lockdown a lot differently. And I find that really interesting. And I think that's the same for me, just sort of through a literary nerd lens than actually getting out there and dating apps and whatever. But it's, take what you can get.
Well, ban sex now came out of it was conversations we were having over lockdown. Like that.
Yeah.
That's why that's where the conversation started. So it's quite interesting. That seems to be quite a common situation. Well, yeah, I guess because it was banned, and you had to maybe because it wasn't there, everyone started kind of thinking about it again.
Yeah.
So yeah. Also, what you were just saying about D.H. Lawrence and the fact that there's the sex there now, but not the politics. Were you talking about the film adaptation?
Yeah. So if you watch any of the more recent ones, they'll bravely sort of enact some of the sex scenes, but all the discussions of politics are left out.
When we were talking to Isabel Miller, we were talking about how it's interesting that now it's more comfortable to talk about sex than class, and I'm actually in sex therapy at the moment, and my therapist asked me how I think my class affects my relationship with sex. And I thought that was a really interesting question. And I asked Isabel Miller it also. So I was thinking, maybe, do you have any kind of anything you'd like to say about that, maybe?
Yeah. It's a really interesting question. I guess as a brief aside before, I kind of thought that the same thing. That's the one thing that it's interesting too about Sally Rooney's books and those adaptations, where I think you have the same thing. There's more of the sex in normal people, I guess, being that lockdown sensation. You compare it to the book, you get all the sex, you don't necessarily get the politics. I think that's really interesting. It's still the same issue. Sex and class, for my own position, I think is. I think that for me, they're as indeterminate as each other in a lot of ways. I think for me, it's less maybe sex and more gender identity that's weirdly confused by sort of growing up. My dad's, I don't really know. My family's got a really weird mix of class backgrounds where both my parents, you could probably say, were middle class, but my dad's family was certainly a lot more working class. My mum's family a lot more middle class, and they kind of just fell in between these kind of class positions for themselves. They both sort of became quite estranged from that. And I never felt I kind of go and see the different grandparents and feel totally between worlds and not really know where to sit, really. And that was kind of, I think, just a general sense of alienation that has followed a lot through life and in relationships more generally. I think that was often the case with gender for me growing up. Before growing a beard, it was always just, denounced as, and kind of quite viciously bullied a lot of the time, getting homophobic abuse. Irrespective of how I ever, openly identified or acted, just always the assumption of sort of being between some sort of fixed, clockable identity. And I think that definitely complicates sex in a way, that sense of alienation. I think for me, my sort of tragedy is that I'm just always attracted to gay girls, and I think that's the trauma of my life is I always end up falling for women that then come out or as gay or have a moment of confusion with me, and that's gets very, very messy. It's happened more times than you think. It's quite awful, actually. But the question of why, I think there's a certain kind of for me, a kind of sort of kindred spirit almost with that kind of being, having a sort of questioned gender identity, maybe falling more on the feminine side of things as far as the people have been concerned in the past. And yeah, I don't know. It's like that. It's something that I think about often, and I've not really found a way to articulate. But it sounds quite flippant, really, to say that. But I think there's something quite telling, I think, about who I end up finding myself attracted to and falling for, and having those kinds of encounters with, that is wholly wrapped up in class positions or uncertain positions, class positions, different relationships to power. I think it was often would have conversations with people growing up that were gay, that they'd probably grown up in care. I spent time in care as a kid. Felt estranged from families, or that's alienated from families, like tick that box. There was always kind of a distrust for relationships with men. Didn't get on with men. Straight men were always quite violent. Gay men, when I was younger, I always found them quite predatory, because I just was quite a bit of a twink when I was maybe 18 years old, and just didn't trust it. So you kind of tick all these boxes where the social relations that I kind of grew up within have sort of really defined the sexual relations that I've ended up having, like, massively. And it's a really complicated thing to unpack, and actually to separate sex from that, really, right? Like who you end up feeling comfortable with, and how that can develop into sexual relationships it's not like it's not a clear-cut thing. It's not easily untangled, and maybe it doesn't need to be. But I think that's probably true of all of us in a lot of ways. The people that sex is never, saying yes to sex, you don't say no to power. It's just a sort of truism almost. I don't know. I'm rambling again, but propensity to ramble. What am I trying to say? Sexual politics are inseparable from politics in general. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make, and I think that's so. How class can affect sex, I don't think I could ever draw a straight line, but there's a line there nonetheless, and following it, I think, is really productive and clarifying for how, if maybe you don't necessarily see the world directly, but how it sees you, or how you can move through it and still sort of be authentic to yourself. It's kind of the nub. Class and sex are, intertwined in really messy and horrifying and kind of productive ways, but I'd probably rather not bother. So ban sex, ban class abolition, and sex abolition. Let's band them together. They're inseparable.
Yeah, that is what I find interesting about lesbianism or lesbian sex, is that, I guess that's the cliche comment that people you hear growing up. It's like, oh, how do lesbians even have sex? Like, because there's no penetration involved. But obviously, like, this is exactly what we're talking about, is like getting away from this singular idea of like what it means to. So my question was, do you think that you may be a gay girl, Matt?
Well, this is like, I don't know, I'm still figuring it out. I think there was a tweet that I found felt really seen by, that was a trans woman on Twitter tweeting I'm a guy who likes girls but in a queer way pipeline to with the O being, it's not sexual identity that's the queerness, it's your gender identity. And I've been using they, them pronouns for a couple of months, which I'm not wholly comfortable with at the moment. But I think it's precisely it's that idea of separating sex from body and pleasure. Painfully aware of how I look on the outside. I'm like 6'2", broad as fuck. I look like a rugby player. As a kid, I was a figure skater. Like, I've got an inner spirit that does not coincide with how I look on the outside. And that's always been the kind of trauma, actually. So there's this kind of affirmation for me anyway, in thinking about they them pronouns, is this like, yeah, there's a gay girl inside me. She just wants to come out and play and have a nice time. But that's which sounds really weird to say out loud, but what's underneath that is kind of all of that complexity, I suppose. It's those feelings of alienation from class, from not just, from sex and sexuality, and how to negotiate that feeling of in-betweenness that's always been there. It's something I kind of come back to a lot, actually. It's that idea of unstable identity. I'm also adopted, and there's like a factoid that I find really interesting, that people who are adopted or have been in care or fostered are disproportionately more likely to come out as trans or non-binary. I think it's like 4 to 5% of people that have been in care, compared to 1% of the population. And I guess, in a way, it's a way of trying to explain away my own feelings through certain circumstances that aren't true for everyone. I could probably look at the course of my life and see reasons why I would have an unstable sense of identity, or feel alienated from myself or from people around me, and how that affects thought patterns. Doesn't mean that grounds it in any way, and people that haven't had those experiences can still authentically be, trans or non-binary. But for me anyway, I think finding that narrative at least helps with self-acceptance, and kind of helps with having sex. That's that's the kind of the strangeness of that sex positivity thing, that it's finding a way to engage with other people tenderly, is really difficult, and isn't really possible through the ways that we insist upon sex and insist upon the body, socially. Because for the most part, I think a lot of people probably feel like yourselves do, even from the things that you've said tonight as well, that those are the things that do cause that sense of alienation and instability, and wanting to figure out other ways of doing things that are very possible. You kind of just have to give yourself permission first, I suppose. You reminded me of it, Alex, as well when you're talking about Baudrillard and that seduction book, because I think he has that. It feels like a really outdated and French male example where he's talking about stripping. I think it's that same point of the eroticism of stripping ends when the woman, and for him it's always a woman, is fully nude. Nudity isn't erotic, it's the teasing, it's the mystery. But there's a part in that book where he talks quite a bit about narcissism. And I was writing a book about narcissism over lockdown, where he sort of talks about how you need a kind of narcissism to strip that's not necessarily just self-love or a sense of positivity, but you kind of have to affirm that instability. You have to affirm that relationship to the outside world, that teasingness. You have to have a self-awareness. It's far more complex than just, I look great, look at me. You have to really understand, to be a good stripper, you really have to understand the politics that are at play, the visual and aesthetic politics, that are kind of ultimately can be transformative. And I think that's kind of what I find really interesting. Writing this book, where narcissism initially was always, the term was first coined as a way to pathologize homosexuality. But then you read a lot of queer and especially gay male literature that really affirms that position, and it is always this question of sexual relation that isn't fixed but is actually transformative. So for Narcissus, it's not simply that he loves himself and drowns, it's that he tears himself apart and is reborn. He destroys his own body and then returns as a daffodil, as a Narcissus. He was named for the flower, not the other way around, which I think people assume the opposite often. The flower was already known. But yeah, narcissism is kind of ubiquitous in so much queer literature for that reason, where it's a real questioning of how you relate to the world and people around you. And it kind of comes back to Foucault, that there's, I think my reliance on this term tenderness comes from Hervé Guibert, who was Foucault's lover at one point, I think. He was a photography critic at Le Monde in France. and became really famous in the 90s for publishing the first AIDS memoir that was called To the Friend That Did Not Save My Life. And it was this big sort of gossipy drama because when Foucault died, no one knew how he died, and it was Guibert that kind of gave the secret away, that maybe wasn't his to give, that Foucault had died of AIDS. And he kind of narrates his relationship with Foucault in the last few months of his life, and Foucault goes to San Francisco and spends time in all the baths there, and he sort of goes cruising. And Guibert sort of asks him, you know, aren't those places dead now? You know, why is they're surely empty because everyone's afraid of this virus? And Foucault says, no, they're better than ever because the fear lurking everywhere gives rise to new complicities, new tenderness, and new solidarities. And so people are aware of this sort of thing that could kill them, is killing gay men. But as a result, they lose that sheen of performativity. They know why they're there. They're now far more honest and candid about what they want and describing and talking about their desires, their bodies, their pleasures, beyond simply just having sex, because sex itself becomes this really dangerous thing. And so if you can't have sex, if you're wary of having sex, then what comes from that? And, you know, for Foucault, it's this whole new sense of sexuality that's deeply liberating and transformative, and that comes from a kind of deep care for your community and care for yourself that kind of deals, quite frankly, with death and, yeah, with kind of narcissism and all of that sort of stuff. And that's what I find, I think, quite fascinating in all of this, I suppose. You know, ban sex now, and then we do that, and then what comes up from underneath that sort of monolith, that sexual monolith, new solidarities, new tenderness, new complicities. There's various different sexual, if not sexual cultures, subcultures that know that intuitively. It's just never quite made it through to sort of a heteronormative mainstream culture, but it's probably about time it did.
It's interesting what you were saying about like when sex becomes like dangerous, because we were talking recently about like the idea that like sex is always a bit risky, and like is that kind of why it's worth talking about, and also like why it can be so good, like that there's kind of underlying risk kind of when you have sex.
There's a certain, like I guess that's the sort of death drive element. It's, I don't know, it's the terms of talking about it always seem like they've sort of been done to death, but a sort of battalion thing of, you know, it's sex as kind of expenditure, as wastage, as death. It all sounds quite sort of bleak but also quite cliche at this point, but I think it's true. It is this kind of great expenditure, and, you know, we live in a cost of living crisis, so it's all the time it's sort of we're told to restrain ourselves, and that's the weird thing about sex too, right? It is this insistence upon a kind of sexual effluence, that experimentation you're talking about. That's probably quite superficial because it's expressive, but it doesn't necessarily spend its currency, if that's such a thing, in a way that, you know, sex is a gamble, life's a gamble, like that's kind of the thrill of it, but you can restrict the confines of that gamble, and it's not really. I'm starting to trip over my own metaphors here, but I think what I'm tripping over in my head is that I'm really aware that it's also something that comes up a lot in sort of mental health discourses, that like sexual promiscuity can be seen as a sign of mental illness, because it's kind of, you're being reckless, you're risk-taking, impulsivity, and it's just tied up with all of these different conversations sort of about sexual health, mental health. It's sort of like the politics thing. You can't really separate sexual politics from class politics. You can't really separate sexual health from mental health, from physical health, and that sense of risk it's probably why it's kind of quite so thrilling, because there's so much on the line. It's also kind of how it can become quite so unsexy and sort of objectified, because again it sort of gets tangled up with clinical discourses so easily. then again, that feels separate to sexuality. Like, that's kind of the thing, right? We can talk about sex as kind of being a symptom of mental illness. We don't do that with sexuality anymore. But that being a really recent development, and part of that sort of separation of the two, not subordinating sex to sexuality, leaving that space open, thinking about how the sort of the risks and the potential damage of sex, that sexuality in itself doesn't necessarily have to replicate or be tied to, doesn't have to belong to the mess, I suppose, while still being messy. I don't know what I'm talking about.
I feel like a lot of what you were saying about tenderness and solidarity, it felt like, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but is it suggesting a kind of sexual culture or sexuality? Because I guess there are many, and it's not that one is like the one good one. We know this,
Sure.
But rather than sort of this kind of masturbatory act that is sort of using the other as a means to an end, that is sexual gratification, which is alienating, because if the other is an object, like, you don't have that mutual recognition, right? So is it kind of this being with and sort of this mutual recognition, or like subjectivity? Is that, am I understanding it right?
I think that's what I find really interesting, especially about, I guess it's like, I feel like I'm sort of between two projects where this is kind of the heart of it. The book about narcissism is mostly focused on men. There aren't really any women in it, and I was quite uncomfortable about that for my own sense. But I think it's sort of something that's more easily pulled out from specifically gay male subcultures, which are probably, as being wrapped up in patriarchy, they're far more visually dominant. I think they're far more seen, and I think that's kind of it sort of does fit into a lot of discussions, that these sort of cultural discussions that we're having around, like, that we're having, that the fucking country's having, that don't really have much interest in partaking in. But again, the optics, right, of like drag queens reading children's books at libraries being this new moral panic that's probably been imported from the US. It's that conflation, right, of a kind of something that is seen as being part of a culture of sexuality, or that is related to sexuality and gender. I guess it's, the two being separate, but kind of modes of expression being sort of side by side, and separating that from sex, as if this, a drag queen in front of children is an innately erotic thing to present them with, which it's that kind of thing that I find interesting in kind of talking about sexual subcultures. For sort of lesbian culture, it actually feels far less visible, or at least sort of relatively speaking, there's a kind of like tension there that I'm kind of not drawn out yet, or sort of formed any real opinions on, that I feel comfortable enough sharing. But I guess that's it, right? I guess what you're saying, there are these different subcultures, there are different ways of expressing different kinds of sexuality, gender identity, that don't have to rely on sex at all, really. I think that's kind of the what's that guy? Is it? I always think about Tom of Finland. I think he's an illustrator who just draws the most brilliant pictures of like leather daddies and bears. And I remember I ordered something from a record label that's based in Finland, and like they put some of his illustrations on stamps, like just this burly hairy guy in a leather harness, just like on my post. And I remember my partner at the time being like, "What have you ordered?" And I was like, "It's a CD. This is the postal service of Finland. Like, it's not." But that was in itself interesting, right? It wasn't like the assumption that celebrating that visual culture means that whatever is contained or within it will probably be like, as if I just, this is the stamp that made, like, I'd probably ordered porn or something. But actually separating that and celebrating that aesthetic culture for what it is, beyond it necessarily having to be it can be a sexual culture without being sexualized, or it can be sexy without necessarily being pornographic or whatever. That kind of, engaging with different bodies and different ways of that bodies are displayed to, and the pleasures that they enjoy. I'm sure I've seen like some probably bad internet art where someone's got like the statue of David and put like a leather harness on it or something. But that's kind of an interesting provocation in itself, right? That kind of visibility, where we can look at the statue of David, or we can look at whatever different Venus de Milo or whatever, these different representations of bodies that we don't necessarily have to sexualize despite their nudity. But you put a harness on someone, and you put a kind of you clothe someone. You put a kind of a piece of clothing that's associated with a certain sexual subculture, and immediately it's sexualized. It's that kind of tension that I find really interesting. I don't know if that answers your question, and I mean, I don't really have an answer to it either. But that's the kind of thing I guess I mean in the sort of cultural question of sex and sexuality, and one not necessarily having to be subordinate to the other, even though I think when that is the case, it's interesting to me how that's more forcibly done for queer cultures, that the subordination is more enforced, weirdly, in a negative sense, than you get in sort of heterosexual representation. But sorry.
No, I was just going to say that you went beyond the question.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm like, rambling. I have a propensity to just run my mouth.
Oh, that's great, yeah.
Yeah, no, please don't let me interrupt you.
No, please do.
Well, I mean, it is a tricky thing. I think that we've done really well, though, because it's hard to talk about sex in a public setting. You know, you don't want to ask too personal questions, or you don't know what people are comfortable with. But yeah, I feel like we're having a really fruitful discussion, which kind of has a bit of both, you know, which is what we really want to do with this project.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's a great demonstration of how that's possible, right? That kind of subordination. We can talk about sex without being smutty with each other, like as if you can only have like a podcast that takes sex as its topic, and it kind of be some sort of, I don't know, like what people are assuming, that you would end up talking in a certain way or using a certain kind of language that is innately sexual, when really maybe it's, you know, it's not a question of that. It's maybe more of a question of sexuality. Ban sex, and then you can talk about the other things more freely. I think it's a great, it's it's been nice to discover that in the process of talking to you, really. That I agree, it's been lovely, and that's saying something, I think, because I think it can be a difficult conversation to have. I definitely don't have conversations like this IRL, and I probably wish that was more the case, really. Probably be a lot more happier and so sort of socially adjusted. Not that, I mean, I'm making myself sound like a shut-in, but talk about sex a lot with people, but not like this. And I think that's partly what's so intriguing about it. It's the question that I'm left with now is why, and I think you probably know that already. And that's what you're demonstrating, the reasons why you leave sex at the door, and you can then finally talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, see what the IRL conversations are like when we send you the T-shirt.
Sure, yeah. I'm excited about that, actually. I get it a lot with it. Yes, this is I won't bore you with more D.H. Lawrence stories, but it was it's my favourite anecdote from Philip Larkin, that I guess, the plot of Lady Chatterley's Lover, she falls for the gardener, and Philip Larkin used to do the gardening in his like house in Hull, wearing a Lady Chatterley's Lover t-shirt. So in lockdown, got an allotment, and I just got to go and wear this D.H. Lawrence t-shirt. My partner at the time like refused to see me out in it. And probably similar reactions if I wore a Ban Sex now, but it didn't stop me with the other way, so I'll embrace the flip side and see what comes from that as well.
Well, we'll look forward to hearing about it.
Great.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Matt. This was great.
No worries, no, thanks. They're really lovely to chat to you both.
Yeah.
Long time coming.
Perfect, thank you so much.
No worries.
Have a good night.
Enjoy the rest of your evening. Yeah, see you later.
Corner secret.